Hi, welcome back. We are glad to be with you. My name is Bob. I'm here with Todd, and this is a pastor's podcast. We are coming to you from Comstock Park, Michigan, and we are just continuing our series today on family matters. And we've been going through a lot of different family things. We've been honing in on the actual biblical family and what the biblical family is and how the biblical family functions. And now we're going to talk about goals, really, and having a focus. And the reason being is it's a war that's going on right now. And I think oftentimes we as believers, we kind of live in a bubble, and so we don't really know that there is a legitimate war going on. If you're raising kids and your kids aren't saved, it's a war for their soul. We're not talking about the physical battle. We're out fighting people. We're talking about that spiritual battle that's raging. And so for this series, or for this session, and then for the one coming up next week as well, I want to lay out some, we could say, battle plans to what that could look like as a family, especially a family that is discipling kids, to make sure that we're setting them up for spiritual success, at least the best that we can within the confines of Scripture.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, that there's spiritual warfare. And by that, we don't mean everything we think of when we think of that term. We think of people, confronting demons and exorcising demons and those kinds of binding spirits and exorcising, the demon of postnasal drip and whatever other, being the clinics. But when we talk about spiritual warfare, we mean just the normal battle that Christians face living in this world. And as you said, the Christian life is war.
Yeah.
And so as parents, we have to set our kids up to fight that battle and to be equipped for that battle. And I don't think we oftentimes think about the Christian life that way. It's easy just to kind of go through life and stumble through life, but we really have to view the Christian life as a battle. And you and I were both in the military. I was in the Air Force, the better branch. Just kidding. But we both served, and
Right.
So we went through basic training. We were trained and equipped in the different disciplines that we were doing our jobs in the military in case there was a battle.
Right.
So we didn't sign up and they just kind of said, well, figure things out.
If something happens.
Something happens, hopefully we'll win.
Right.
No, we signed up to serve our country, defend the U.S., defend the Constitution. And in the midst of all of that, there was training, there was preparing, there was basic training, there was boot camp, there was all kinds of preparations that we were doing in case we were called upon to defend our country. So take that over into the family context. What are we doing? We're raising warriors. We're raising warriors for the kingdom of Christ, not belligerent people. We're not talking about being arrogant and prideful and those kind of
for a fight.
Looking for a fight, spoiling for a fight. But we're talking about raising children that are ready to engage in a spiritual battle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And I think we've, as you said, we kind of stumble through life. Because especially in our very American context, it has been almost nil with regards to spiritual warfare, at least in our minds, not realizing what was going on behind the scenes. We get in our church bubble or even some cities, right? Like we just feel like, oh, everything's going really, really well. And then all of a sudden, things start to happen. We see, especially in the last 2 years, I think we could say things have been ramped up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And now you see the visible church is turning on the invisible church, if you will.
Yeah.
And so we're going to have to figure out. So we have the world, the flesh, and the devil that are coming after us. And we have to be able to train our children. So the hope is that we ourselves have been trained.
Yeah.
Because using your analogy of, going through military training, those men and women were trained. So therefore, they could then train other people. So the importance of our own spiritual walk then to be able to pass that down to to our children as well. And that's what we want to talk about.
Exactly. And just as a reference, think about Ephesians 6. I mean, the bulk of that chapter is on the importance of preparing for battle.
That's right.
Right? He's talking about the armor of God, and he says our struggle's not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, powers, the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, Ephesians 6:13, take up the full armor of God that you may be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything to stand firm. So here's a summons by Paul to believers to be ready and able to stand firm, because there is a spiritual conflict out there. And it's one that we don't see raging clearly, because we're prone to just perceiving what we can see and sense with our senses. But he's talking about the spiritual conflict that goes beyond the world that we can see and taste and touch and feel. And that's the one that we have to equip our children to fight for.
So we don't just see abortion as a heinous act, which it is, but that driving force behind it is satanic, and it's destroying families, and it's murdering children, and it's the acceptance of an immoral act. Take that with pornography, you can take that with divorce, you can take that with anything. As bad as it is on the surface, which we certainly wouldn't deny the heinousness of it on the surface, but what's driving that behind that is a spiritual battle that Satan is trying to literally take over what's going on here. And that's what we're talking about. How can we build convictions, frame our worldview so we can see those things and not think, oh, it's not that bad, or, oh, it's not happening to me, but realizing, hey, this is a battle that's raging behind the scenes.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul talks about destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And so what's he referring to here? He's talking about ideologies that are worldly, that are going to come against us and our families. And how do we fight the battle? He says in verse 4 of 2 Corinthians 10, the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of forces. And so we're to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. So really what he's getting at in that passage there is there are spiritual conflicts raging in this world that are going to take a mental fortitude and a strength of character to stand up against them. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a godly family. They're putting as many tools in the arsenal of their kids as they can, so that they can launch them into this world and really be able to help them thrive and stand for Christ in the midst of a very destructive world.
Yeah, I think it's very helpful, and that's what we want to do now.
Yeah.
So none of that was on our notes, so we just now we're going to actually get to our notes. So essentially, what we're going to ask, or what we're going to answer, is how do we prepare our minds for the battle that we're in, and then effectively how are we preparing our children's minds? And I would say this flows over to grandchildren. If you're a grandparent, training your grandchildren to think this way, and even your adult kids, right? I mean, it doesn't stop just because they're growing up. And so how do we do that? So the first thing we have to remember, or we have to get our minds around, is we have to be ready. As you were saying before, you don't just join the military, sign on the dotted line, raise your right hand, and they say, okay, when we need you, we're going to call you. Like, no, you're going into it. You're getting prepared. You're going to go through simulation, training, so on and so forth. And so that's what we need to do. And I like this quote, parents need a clear set of biblical goals that function as God-given guardrails to keep us on the road He wants us to travel. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to get these goals that we can set, and we say, here's our family goal, because we don't just want to trip over our family. We don't just want to stumble around being like, I don't know what to do. We want to make sure we're pointing in the right direction. And I think the first one is, which we hear a lot, we all want our kids to behave, right? When we say, I want you to behave, a lot of it's personal idolatry. We don't want to look like unfit parents in front of other people. A lot of it's personal ease. We want our kids to behave so we don't have to do any work. But we don't. The danger you fall into is you are just trying to simply regulate the flesh or reform the flesh, as opposed to getting at the heart. So the first thing is, when you're parenting your kids, you can't just tell them, no, that's not what we do. There has to be an actual heart change that's done there.
Yeah, you're exactly right. That we're not just trying to put restrictions in place to keep their behavior a certain way, because what's going to happen is if that's all we're doing, if all our parenting is external conformity to a certain moral code that we want them to have, what's going to happen when they leave that structure of our family?
Right.
If we've not taught them to fear the Lord, love Christ, love His Word, stand for the things of the Lord in our home, and have a heart that embraces Christ and all that He stands for, when that those structures are off and they're on their own, their real heart's going to come out. So the goal is not to just force our children into a certain code of conduct.
Right.
It's to really shepherd their hearts and to
Right.
help them love the Lord from the heart.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think at the beginning, like you have younger kids, 2, 3 years old, you are just telling them a set of rights and wrongs. Because
Well, yeah.
you're not going to sit down and be like, well, the Bible says this. They just need to know not to do this. But then as their stages grow and they get to where they can understand more, they get into the reasoning stage, they get, all the different stages that your kids go through. Now you're saying, you're not just doing this. As you said, I'm not just building a structure for you so it's simple for me and I look good. But you want them to have that heart change. So when they do leave, their hearts actually change and they have a reason and a motive behind not doing something or doing something, as opposed to, well, that's just how Dad said to do it. That's just how Mom said to do it.
Yeah,
it doesn't work.
I think of Colossians 2 at the end of that chapter, where it talks about these kind of external structures you might put in place. Paul says in Colossians 2, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, which all refer to things destined to perish with the using. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. It's easy to put structures in place and force behavior, but as he says at the end of verse 23, they have no value against fleshly indulgence.
That's right.
So the goal is to shepherd their hearts, help their hearts respond to the Lord, so that they're able to then live in a way that He is honored by, rather than just what Mom and Dad require.
Yeah, it's similar to, something as simple as stealing. If you tell your kids, hey, we don't steal because it's wrong. Well, it's a true statement. We don't steal because it's wrong. But then when you start saying, well, when you're stealing, it's showing a lack of contentment in God. It's showing an idolatry. It's showing you don't love your neighbor. You go on down the list. Now you're starting to get into the heart work of why that is. And so instead of just saying, hey, we don't steal because it's wrong, and then move on to the next moral act, you sit down and you have a conversation with your kids. This is why we're not doing what we're doing. Right. The Bible gives us a standard. Here's the ramifications of that, and so on and so forth. Exactly. Yeah. So we want to make sure we're not just regulating behavior of our kids. The second one is, and we hit on this kind of in our introduction, but I think this is so important. We want to focus on the spiritual struggle, right? And so this kind of goes hand in hand with the behavior modification, having your kids understand we're not just trying to modify your behavior. But I think we have a tendency, and I was thinking about this as I was putting this together, there are times, like especially in our circle of churches, that we don't want to seem overly charismatic or Pentecostal. And you're right, we don't walk into rooms and cast out demons. And, we're not, oh, I got the demon of computer viruses, whatever it happens to be. That's not what we're talking about at all. When you look at the scripture, right, and you get into what Paul's saying, in almost every one of his epistles, he's bringing up this warfare that's raging. And the verse that comes from me is 2 Corinthians 4, and he says, therefore we do not lose heart. And he says, though our outer man is decaying, the inner man is being renewed. And he still goes on, and he says, while we look at things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. So there are things that we don't see that are going on around us that are there, right? And we can't see them. Doesn't mean they're not real.
Right.
It just means that they're not there. And so our kids need to have a focus of there are spiritual things that are going on around us, and the things you can see and touch are not the most important things in life.
Well, yeah, that's what kids do. Kids are drawn to what is seen.
Right.
Obviously, they're going to be drawn to the things that they can experience and touch and taste and feel, and they're prone to wanting to surround themselves with friends. They want their friends to like them. They get disappointed when a friend says something bad about them. They get focused on grades. They get focused on what they wear.
Right.
They get focused on their entertainment choices or whatever. It's all tangible things that can be touched or seen or experienced or whatever. Measurable.
Yeah.
That's just the tendency of the human heart.
Right.
And our job as parents is to help them see beyond those things, to see beyond the seen things to the unseen things. Or another way to put it, to see beyond what's temporal to see what's eternal.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge. It's a challenge for our hearts. Even as adults, we struggle sometimes remembering we need to set our minds on the things above.
Right.
But as parents, we have to help them see this life is not all that we live for. In fact, it's not what we live for. This world is not our home. The things of this world are not what we live for. We store up our treasures in heaven where moth and rust and thieves don't break in and steal, and those things don't destroy. And so that's part of our parenting. We have to help them understand that there is an unseen, eternal world that we have to value more highly than this passing world.
Yeah, and I think when I was thinking about this, kind of an illustration that came to mind, I remember we were at Toys R Us and we actually met a Lego marketing guy that was there. He was setting up displays. And so we actually got a chance to talk to him just because our kids like Lego and we were looking at Lego. And so he was like, hey, let me ask you some questions. So we started talking. And they put the different Lego on the shelves at the age heights, or at the age where the average height is.
Yeah.
And so he said, when you look at the rack, you don't see the Duplo, the 0 to 2 year old up at top because mom and dad don't care. It's way down here.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. And I thought, what a great spiritual illustration of how the world knows exactly how to tempt your flesh, and it's going to put it right in front of you. Because mom and dad walk by it, but your 3.5 foot, 6-year-old or whatever, that's put there for him to see.
Sure.
And that is what the world does. And then that temptation, what that does is he sees that temptation starts to come into his heart, that temptation turns into sin, he starts to covet.
Right.
All of a sudden he then steps into sin as he grabs that Lego box, brings it over, and he desires to have this thing. And so we have to make sure we're telling our kids, like, while that is great marketing, they're playing off of your sinful nature.
Yeah.
Because and it's the same thing, you go into a cell phone store. Why do you always get new cell phones? You get the shiny ones up front, the most expensive ones are up front. Yeah. And the ones that work the exact same but are half as much are in the back.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so everything in this world is geared towards our sinful nature, and it's a spiritual battle because they're coming right at our sinful nature to get us to buy and spend money.
To live for what's transitory.
To live what's transitory, absolutely.
That's the whole thing. That's what we have to help our kids see, is that what you're living for right now in the here and now really, for the most part, doesn't matter for eternity.
Right.
And so we have to teach them to live for the next life, to live for a world that we can't see. This is Hebrews 11. What did Abraham do? He set his hope on the city with foundations in heaven.
That's right.
And Moses, he chose not to endure the ill treatment of the passing pleasures of this world, but chose to endure the ill treatment that were for God's people. Why? Because he was living for another life, another world, another kingdom for eternity. And so one of the goals as parents has to be help your kids see the next world and the next life and store up your treasures there, not here.
Which means that you as a parent can't be storing up your treasures here, right?
Exactly.
You can't say, well, this is all my stuff, but, go think about heavenly things, but I'm storing up my stuff here. So that's good. Focus on the spiritual struggle. And then lastly, the third goal I want to talk about is teaching the qualities of a warrior. And so we're training our kids. We want to change their hearts, and this is a big deal, right? Shifting and molding your children's hearts. This takes a lot of time. Because, for all intents and purposes, most kids aren't saved when they're 5 or 6 years old. So you're going to be pouring into them for maybe a decade, and you're going to be molding and shaping their heart. You're going to be telling them about the spiritual things. You're going to be telling them, hey, let's not live for the world. You're going to be modeling it for them. Then there comes a time where you're going to have to teach them some very specific things. And I remember your series on Proverbs. And so this is what stuck out to me. There must be a single-mindedness to please the Lord in all we do, but we're doing it because we fear him. Now, this always sounds kind of counterintuitive to the Christian. Well, I thought I called Jesus friend now, right? I thought we were buddies. I thought it was Abba Father, right? So maybe you can talk to this because you taught on this through Proverbs. What does it mean for the Christian where it says we are to fear the Lord? What is the connotations that come in with that?
Well, I think first of all, there is a sense of fear, legitimate terror. That's how we normally think of it. And I think out of respect for God, there ought to be a sense of, I don't want to fall into the hands of a living God.
Amen.
Right? So there ought to be that. But I think when we think mostly of the fear of God, we're thinking about a genuine reverence and respect, a desire to honor him and worship him in all things. I think that's what you're getting at, that to fear the Lord is to do that. It's to care more about what he thinks than anyone else thinks.
Right.
It's to want to honor him more than I want to honor anyone else in this world. It's to want to live for the things that are most important to him rather than the things that are most important to me or what anyone else thinks. So, as you said, Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of the wisdom. This is where it starts. And to train warriors for the kingdom, it has to start with this single-minded devotion and desire to please God in all things. That has to be the overwhelming passion of our hearts, to please the Lord. And we're going to stand before him someday. And so are we going to please him? Are we going to live for the things that he is pleased by? Then that has to be drilled down deep into the hearts of our kids.
Yeah, and I think as you just said, we're going to have to stand before him one day. And that is a spiritual concept that we can't touch right now.
Right.
So for us, it's like, okay, yeah, I got to stand before him, but I just want to do this one thing over here. So it's almost like the passing pleasures of sin are drawing us away because we can see sin.
Yeah.
And so it's not that bad. Who am I hurting? But meanwhile, it's like this, invisible chest of things being stored up in them. And you're going to have to stand and give an account for those when you stand before God.
Absolutely.
Right. And then so we teach our kids the single-mindedness, the pleasing the Lord, the fearing the Lord. And then secondly, we teach them a submission to authority. And I think if I had to guess, out of these 5 that we wrote down here, this is the one that's been tossed to the wayside.
I agree.
This is something that was drilled into my head growing up. My dad was old-fashioned, but he says every person, Romans 13, every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities. And I like this, for there is no authority except God. And those which exist are actually established by God.
Right.
So God is the ultimate authority. God then puts people in authoritative positions, and he calls us as believers to be submitted to those. So whether it's mom and dad, teacher at school, a police officer, a judge, your mayor, your city council, whatever it happens to be, we can say God's divinely appointed those people to be there in one way or another, and we are called to submit to them.
I think one of the greatest threats to young people today is a lack of submission to authority.
Absolutely.
And look at high school age kids, young people, look at college age young people, and probably what you will see is an overwhelming characterization of those age groups is a flat out disrespect for authority.
Yeah. It's not hidden anymore either.
It's not hidden. No, I mean, we live it. It's just obvious now.
Yeah.
No one wants to submit to the government, police officers, defund the police movement, disrespect for instructors and teachers and parents and church and elders and all of that. It's just, it is a pandemic, pardon the use of the term, a pandemic. And I believe as parents, we have to teach our children to submit to that authority because authority works even when it seemingly fails.
Yeah.
Because God is the one, as you said, who put all those authorities in place. So we're not ultimately submitting to the earthly authorities, we're submitting to the Lord. And so to allow a child to be raised up in a culture that flaunts its insubordination is to do disservice to our children. They need to come under authority. 1 Peter 5:5, young men submit to those in authority over you. That's talking about elders in the church, but the principle is still the same.
Right.
We need to teach our kids to come under the authorities that God has established because it's for their good.
Yeah.
Even if it's not what they like and it goes against every grain in them, whatever, it's still for their good. It's for their safety, protection, their health, their well-being, for their spiritual benefit to submit to authority. And frankly, the call to the gospel is a submission to authority.
The biggest submission we can do is admit we are sinners and bow our knee.
Come under the lordship of Jesus
right.
Christ. So if you can't, if you are raised in a home where you're not taught to submit to authority, you're going to be unlikely to come to Christ because that call is a call to submit to authority.
That's right.
So don't bifurcate those. Don't say, well, you need to come to Jesus and become a Christian and then not challenge
buck all the authority.
Buck all the other authorities. No, they go together.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that's really helpful. And then telling our kids and being separate from the wicked, choosing our friends wisely. I remember years ago before I was married, and I heard a pastor teach on 1 Corinthians 15, and it was something that impacted me. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. And you see it time and time again, and believers think that they can handle the situation that they're going into, especially young kids. And maybe the young kids aren't saved, and maybe they're morally sound, they're in a good home, and then, either by their own choice or by the parent allowing them, they find themselves around kids that we would classify as the bad crowd or something like that. And we need to tell our kids, hey, the people you hang around with, they're going to be influencing you. You are not going to influence. The Bible doesn't say, hey, this one good person is, good person, right, into this group of people. All of a sudden, everyone's going to be, no. I mean, we see that with Jonah, but that's only one.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, this I think we have to tell our kids, you need to be wise in who you're hanging out with.
Absolutely. Read the first half of Proverbs 1.
Yeah.
That's the whole point of that first section is choose your friends wisely, because who you hang around with is going to dramatically impact who you become. And I think particularly parents need to be willing to draw a line in the sand at times and say, we're picking your friends.
Yeah.
Obviously you can't entirely do that, but you have to draw the line and say, listen, this crowd is not healthy, and you can't be around them anymore, because it's going to be detrimental to your spiritual health and the influences in your life.
Yeah, and this actually goes back to submission to authority, because you are the authority in your parent or your kid's life, right? And so you're the one telling them, hey, as an authoritative figure, which God has given you,
that's right,
you need to shepherd that child to make sure they're not the wrong people.
That's right.
Next one, disciple our children to think biblically and see the world and interpret the facts through a biblical lens. So what we've seen is the biblical literacy drop tremendously, right? So obviously as the biblical literacy drops, as biblical understanding drops, we're now seeing things through a worldview. And really I would say that worldview is so subjective, because now we're saying truth doesn't matter. We're in a post-truth era, where what that means is, your truth is relevant to you. What makes you feel good is your truth, so on and so forth. So that's where we're living now. But we're telling our kids is, hey, that's a fallacy, right? Like that we shouldn't be holding to that, because just as your emotions wane, your truth is going to wane. And if something's true, it's not going to go with the seasons, right?
Yeah.
So we want to help them frame up a biblical worldview. And then Colossians 2:8. See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the tradition of men, elementary principles of the world, but rather be according to Christ, right? And so how would you help parents do that to help frame the kids' view through a biblical worldview?
Yeah, so I think about a net. What's the best net? Mm-hmm. The best net is one that has, it's tight. There's not a lot of gaps. If you're trying to catch whatever, a fish, if you got big holes in the net, a lot's going to slip through there, right? And so our job as parents is to make that net as tight as possible, because we want our kids to filter everything through the net of Scripture, the lens of Scripture. And so the best thing you can do is just teach your kids the Word.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not rocket science. It's sometimes hard, but it's not complicated. Right. Just teach them the Word faithfully, year after year after year after year. Help them form that theological net, that biblical net that will be the filter that everything comes through.
And then walk through it with them.
Yeah.
Because
and help them filter it through the situations that they're in.
How would you handle this situation? Put them in the milieu. Hey, you're here. This is happening. What does the Bible say about this, right? Yeah. And then you can kind of find those leaky spots and hopefully shore them up a little bit. And then lastly, we'll end on this one. Disciple our children to have biblical self-awareness. And I find, maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but as a young man in my 20s, early 20s I wasn't saved, mid-20s I got saved. My early 20s, I thought I knew everything and everything was good and I had everything under control. Then you get saved and you realize you're really not there. But I think this is what Paul's talking of here. And he says, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think. And we need to tell our kids, you may think you're standing on solid ground, but you need to have self-awareness and be able to look at yourself. We'll talk about this in the next episode a little bit more. Yeah. But be able to look at yourself and say, where are some areas that I got some of those big holes in my neck, right?
Yeah, even in their character. These are hard conversations to have sometimes with your kids, but we love them enough to say, listen, you're strong in this area. There's some great skills and character tendencies that the Lord's built into you, but you also have these weaknesses. And you're more prone to sin in this area. And you have to be aware of those sinful tendencies in your own heart. and the areas you're going to be deceived and tempted in. And so that's that self-awareness that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not just a humility about themselves, which is important, but we're also wanting to help them understand how God has put them together and maybe some of those weak spots in their life that they need to shore up so that when they get out on their own, they're already equipped to deal with the sinful temptations that are already in their heart.
Yeah, and I think even part of what you said, which wasn't the main point, you said tell them the areas that they're doing well in.
Yeah.
And that's okay to compliment your kids.
Absolutely.
Because that's even part of this, teaching them to have qualities of a warrior. When you see something that's good, when you see they've utilized that net that they've built, and they say no to sin, and they say yes, don't just treat it as the everyday thing. Tell them, hey, that was really good what you did there.
Absolutely.
And make sure you're encouraging them to continue to grow.
That's good.
Yeah. All right, guys, well, I hope this is helpful. As I said, next week we're going to continue this. We're going to look at a few more goals that we can have as parents. And so we hope that it's a fruitful time. As always, if you have any questions or anything about family that we could help you out with, please feel free to shoot us an email. So I hope you guys have a good rest of the week.